So, Sam, it's no secret you work for NCLS, but you are the undercover Baptist in NCLS. That's right, isn't it? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your own church experience, Sam.
Yeah, there might be more than one of us. I'm not sure, but
There might be.
yeah. And I'm looking at the screen. I'm seeing two guys who used to work for us as well. So yeah, you guys. It's lovely to see some faces I know and some others that I know from elsewhere too. Yeah. So I grew up in the Sydney Anglican Church, and then when I was in my 20s, late 20s, after I got married and we had a kid, moved into Churches of Christ, and I worked as a pastor for Churches of Christ on staff, first of all in a program, and then as a temporary pastor, what I like to call an unintentional interim, actually, because it was a situation where the other pastors left, and they asked if I would hold the fort while they found a new person, and that lasted a couple of years, and that was a fantastically stretching time. And then when the new guy came, I actually stayed on as an elder for another 7 years and supported and helped things, keep going before we moved on to a Baptist church. So yeah, we're now at Parramatta Baptist. It feels, if I said PBC, no one would know what I meant, because it seems like one of the things I've learned from the Baptist churches is everybody refers to their church as some sort of acronym that they expect everybody to just know what it means. So it's really funny. Whereas if you're in another, we all live in silos, don't we, in these denominations? So I've been working for NCLS for nearly 20 years, 20 years next year. And so I get to peek into each of the different silos. And it's funny to hear the way people talk differently about their churches, or how they say exactly the same things, but as if they're the only movement. And one of our great privileges, obviously, with NCLS is to learn from all the different churches. And so if you wanted to sum up really what are we trying to do when we're looking at all the churches in Australia, we're basically asking ourselves, what do all the healthy churches have in common? Okay, so we can look across the different silos, the different denominations, or even different traditions, because even within the Baptist movement there's actually some distinctiveness in different traditions, I think you could say. But what do all the healthy churches have in common? And of course, you've even got to define, well, what on earth is church health? So we're going to talk a bit about that today. And I think if I had a tribe, it would probably be Baptist New South Wales, because I feel very at home there, and our family's been part of that for some years now. But I guess, yeah, I'm one of these people that gets to hover over and get to know different groups, which is an incredible privilege.
Yeah, that's good. Well, thanks for being with us, Sam. With Baptist Association, we've got a really good relationship and working partnership with NCLS, and the leadership team of the association's met a few times with Sam, and we really appreciate that. And our Baptist Care is a significant partner with NCLS, and so we've got a good relationship, and we really hope that especially in the next, it's next year, is the next one next year, Sam? Yeah, that's right, isn't it?
Second half of next year, yeah.
Second half of next year, we're going to be really encouraging every single church in our Baptist family to take part next year, because the more data that we find, the better we can strategize to do God's work together and deploy resources and look at the way things that God might have us do next. So we're happy for you to speak. We're really happy that you're here and to speak into us. And I'm going to throw it over to you now, Sam, and just share with us. That'd be great. Thanks.
All righty. Thanks, Gray. I'm just going to start sharing my screen, and then you can look at my lovely slides instead of me. So people can see that?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. Okay. So, just picking up on Gray's comments, the Baptist churches have started to become a real powerhouse of using this tool that really is pretty unique to Australia from around the world. We go to international conferences from time to time on church-related research, and people regularly tell us we have the best data in the world because of the cooperation we have between virtually all the denominations and the number of churches that take part. And and the Baptist churches have really started to lean in and realise what a resource the NCLS stuff is for planning. Now, it's not supposed to take over. You still need to prayerfully know as a church what is your calling and what is your vision, etc. But it's something that could inform that. So yeah, and it's just recently, Baptist Care New South Wales have stepped in and are now a member of our board, which is a pretty small board. I think there's currently 3 organisations on that board and a couple of independent people as well. So yeah, it's a strong relationship that's getting stronger, and we're talking to other states as well. So look, guys, I want to talk about 3 things today. And I'm going to try and talk for maybe 10 or 15 minutes on each, although the first one might be a little bit longer and the others might be shorter. First of all, I want to talk about priorities for local churches. And this is stuff that's come out of our work over years and years, but particularly at the end of last year, we did a summit that I think 1 or 2 of you might have come to, and I've picked some of the really best bits out of that summit that was saying, what have we found from some research into healthy churches in Australia, and what would we actually recommend? So we're actually wanting to move more and more into saying, so what with our stuff. One of the things that we're hearing back from people is we don't say enough, so what? You know, what does this mean? We've really left it with people. We don't like to be prescriptive at NCLS because we don't actually, even when you do a survey, we don't believe that we know your church as well as you do. And I've got to say, I feel doubtful about models that tell you what you should work on because I don't think there's any real research basis for that at this stage, although that might change in the future. So I want to talk about some of the so what, and I've also just mentioned at the beginning here that I'm really happy to get feedback from you. So on that first slide, there's my email address. It'll be up on the last slide as well. And I'll be able to send you these slides. So don't feel like you have to take pictures of the screen or save it or anything. And also someone's recording this. So, you know, you'll be able to look at stuff again if you miss something. But I'm happy to hear from you, happy to get an email from you personally. And you can also use the chat feature in Zoom now to send a message to whoever's hosting. I'm not sure who that is, but if you've got a question. So at the end of this, we're going to have a bit of a question time. And so even though I'm going to move through 3 big topics, I'm not going to stop for questions in between because that usually gets out of hand. So if you've got a question, you can send it to the chat or just make a note of it yourself. Yeah, so let's get back to PowerPoint. Right, so that's what we're covering. Priorities for local churches. 4 things to think about when reviewing your church. I must admit, I shuddered a bit when I wrote that topic, but I know that's how people write headings these days. But I actually do have 4 things that I think are really important to share if you're thinking about reviewing your church. Questions you should be asking yourself, things you should not be missing. And I also want to say some stuff about sustainable leadership at the end, particularly at the time that we're in now. This is a challenging time for leaders. And I'm not just talking about you folks, I'm also talking about the leaders in your church that work with you. So I'd like us to reflect for a moment on that. But I'm going to start by talking about church health. And here's a picture that many people will have seen in the past, this picture of what is church supposed to do? And this idea that we relate with God, that's up, we relate with each other, that's in, and we relate with the wider community, that's out. And so there's that picture. It's appeared in a lot of our books over the years, in, out, and up. And but the thing that's missing out of that picture is the last sentence there, which is that we also have to have vital leadership and directions for the future, and that isn't really locatable on that particular diagram. So I want to talk about the up relationship for a minute with how are our churches around Australia going when it goes to relationship with God. What are we learning there from our research? And so what? Well, I'm going to start with the so what, actually. We want to encourage churches to think of discipleship as a corporate activity. I think it's very easy, particularly in Australia and other Western countries, where things have become privatised, where faith has become privatised, where faith is considered by many it should be a private matter, that we've kind of brought in a little bit too much to that idea of individualistic faith. And yes, it is important to have a personal relationship with God, but we are seeing the strength in the churches that are dealing with discipleship also as a corporate activity. So the 2 examples are, these are 2 recommendations, if you like. Help families share faith with family members. So don't tell families that they should be outsourcing their faith sharing to you or to your church or to the private school if the kids go to a Christian school. we are seeing that kids are retained in church most easily when families are sharing faith at home, and that's an open thing. So that's number one. Second thing is invest in worship services. Don't be afraid to do that. We've seen a huge trend in that, and we think it's a good thing. And invest in them as a core mission activity. And I think that some of us have played with seeker services and seeker-friendly stuff in the past. That's one way to go. I'm currently part of a church plant, actually. So Parramatta Baptist moved out of Parramatta about 30 years ago into a surrounding suburb. And now that people live in Parramatta again, we've planted back in a small plant, and I'm part of that. And we're really conscious about being missional in every part of our service, because it's amazing how easily everybody, even in this church plant, just wants to drift back to comfortableness, just wants to drift back to doing the things that we like, singing our favourite songs, even if they're full of jargon and hard to sing and not particularly helpful for a new person. So we are constantly saying, no, we're here for the new person. We're here for the tens of thousands of people who live in Parramatta now who don't know Jesus and who are actually quite open to connecting with someone spiritually. So we would recommend that as a second thing. So here's a couple of findings that led to those two things. First of all, we have seen that attenders highly value in church sermons, Bible teaching, praying for one another, and communion. And that's particularly true of the Baptist churches. And when we ask them, what do you think should be top priorities in this church? The top one that comes out for Baptist churches always is spiritual growth. So that idea that discipleship is the main thing that we want teaching, that hasn't gone away. Secondly, we're looking here at people over time are saying more and more that their churches are helping them grow in their faith. So that's a good thing. Most of the trends today that I'm sharing actually are good news. People haven't always associated NCLS with good news because we also track decline, and we also have to say the hard things to movements, especially movements that aren't adapting. I think that the Baptist Church is pretty adaptive actually, and while remaining biblical. And I think that most of what we're sharing today is actually really heartening, because it's about what churches are doing to adapt, what churches are doing to continue to be relevant. So it's not largely a picture of decline or bad news in what I'm sharing today. When it comes to worship services, this is the most stark trend I think I've seen in our data. Churches are clearly, over the last 15, 20 years, focusing more and more on the experience of having quality worship. And I think that's got a lot to do with the fact that we're online more, we see mega churches, we watch worship stuff online, and people have expectations, and people have very little denominational loyalty as well. So we would encourage, yes, keep investing into worship to make sure this is a good place to come, and this is a good place to bring your friends. That's it. That is important. And there's another graph there with 4 lines to say it's not just one thing we're measuring about worship, but 4 different things we've measured about worship over the last 20 years have all been going up. So that's those first 2 things. Help families share faith with family members, and invest in worship services as a core mission activity. So the second part of the diagram is the relating to each other. We've looked at relating to God and particularly focused on discipleship, relating to each other. And here's the recommendations here for priority. Give ongoing attention to helping people belong. So particularly, we need to provide newcomers into church and returnees who have been in church sometime in the past, kids who grew up in Sunday school and now had kids, and they realise they want their kids to have some kind of input too. Provide those people with ways to meet and intentionally build community there. And the key word there for me is intentionally. That so many churches are focused on, we're getting together because we're doing this. We're going to have this message, or we're going to have this event. We're going to have this person performing, or we're going to have this guest speaker. And the building community can just happen in the gaps, in the cracks. It happens at morning tea after church, and quite often that's something that people are really, really looking forward to. So don't be afraid, especially I think now, to intentionally build community, make a priority of those things. That shouldn't happen by accident, because that is a major part of what people are searching for. And we also want to there's a lot we could say about multicultural churches. All of Sydney is becoming more and more multicultural, and many movements are actually saying to us this has been a huge source of growth for them. In fact, I've even had leaders of denominations say, we think this is pretty much the only churches of ours that are growing. That's not what Baptists have said to me, but what others have said. So the multicultural factor is really important. And what we have found is that when you have a group, a variety of multicultural people meeting in church, you have to get them relating to each other across groups. The churches that are doing that are more likely to show the real things of health. So a multicultural church will automatically be a happy haven for people who have immigrated and who want some connection with people who are in the same boat as them. But we need to make sure that spreading happens, not so that everyone can become whiter, but so that we can all enrich each other, and particularly the legacy of our faith from different people can be shared. We find that the churches that are truly multicultural, that have maybe have a major group, and then they have at least 20% of another group in that church as well. So there's not a dominant group by itself, but there might be several groups. And those churches where they're interacting, they are the healthiest. We've seen sense of belonging going up in the churches over time. So that's important, that churches are valuing community. We've seen involvement going up, particularly in prayer and Bible study groups. So there's a bit of bumpy lines there, but you can see the trend there compared to 25 years earlier, that more people are actually involved in home groups now in Protestant churches. And we think that's a good thing. We think that's another sign of adaptation, that people want that connection and that churches are adapting to that. Because let's remember all the time, there are churches that aren't around anymore, okay? There are churches that have closed. These are the churches that haven't closed. These are the churches that are continuing on. So we see that as a health trend. And then just that mention of ethnicity again, multicultural churches. Did you know that in Australia, we have about 28% of our churches that we could call multicultural. And that makes us the most multicultural church nation in the world. Okay, so second is probably the USA, and it's got less than 20% of churches. There's a lot of segregation still in American churches. So based on the typical measure that they use to rate that, that's a pretty awesome finding. And so we have got a natural strength there, and we need to build on it. So that's those next two recommendations. So now we're going to talk about out, and this is connecting out to the wider community. And our recommendations here is action with witness. They go together. Okay, so here's three examples of that. So we want to encourage people to invite others. We want to encourage volunteering in both church and community groups. And we want to help people find words to express why they do what we do. So, for example, here's another line that tells us that the people who are in churches in Australia are still as into volunteering and into serving in the community as they were 20 years ago, which is heartening, because I think some of us thought that maybe this is going to drop off as the pre-war generation get really old and are no longer, so much out there volunteering. Is that going to be carried on by the next generation? So I think that's still a live question. But we can see that when we ask people in churches, how much have you been involved, not in a church program and not even in a community program, but how much have you informally been blessing someone else by giving them money or by caring for them or visiting them in hospital or various ways? This is an upward trend that people in church still do this. It's a fallacy to say that church attenders, only volunteer for church. They volunteer all over the place. And so here's a graph that shows the orange line shows another increasing trend, that more people in churches are now involved in church-based community service, okay, or justice or welfare things. So your church might not run anything like that. So if your church did the NCLS, no one's going to say they're in that because there isn't such a program. But many churches run programs of some kind or other that connects with the community, and 25% of church attenders across Australia say they're involved in something like that. And then that blue line is similar sorts of activities, except they're not church run. They're being run in the community. And so church members are also huge volunteers in terms of connecting, just joining their community group as a Christian. And there's a witness there as well. That you can see that line hasn't really changed barely at all over the 15-year period on the graph. But it's a high number. It's almost equal numbers of people in both. So we would say these are good things to be doing, to be connecting. Then there's the sharing faith, not just the service, not just the action, but the proclamation, if you like. So there's a number of different things that we measure there. Inviting others to church is the big one because it's a behaviour. It's easy to ask and get a straight answer on. Have you invited someone to church in the last 12 months? And about just over a third, as you can see, people say, yes, I have. Then there's another group. In most groups, it's about the same size. It says, well, I haven't, but I would. I haven't in the last 12 months, but I really am looking to invite. But that group that are inviting is critical. And this is one of the slightly downward trends that we see in our data. One of the concerning things is that inviting has gone down a bit over the last 15, 20 years. If you go further back, it's worse. So that is a concern, because if you look at those other two lines, the orange and the green lines, they're going up, and they are people who are willing to share their faith and look for opportunities to do that, and also people who are involved in outreach. So it's not that they're going down. So there's a willingness to share, but for some reason or other, depending on the church, I'm sure, and the person, people are not quite as much inviting friends to church as they used to be. This may not be true of your church, but it's true overall. And so we would say, back to the next recommendations, encourage inviting others. But of course, we do also need to ask ourselves, if it's not happening so much, why not? So back to that picture, and then I put the word leadership. So where is leadership in this? Because if we're not measuring leadership in our research, then we're just not doing our job. So we do have another way of looking at church health other than that diagram, because leadership is really important. And we talk about vision, innovation, and leadership culture at NCLS when we talk about leadership, because these three concepts just keep coming up again and again as critically important in healthy churches. No matter what sort of questions we ask, and when we change wording and all those kinds of things, we still get these issues coming up as really important. And yet they're somewhat invisible, a bit like they're invisible on that diagram. They're invisible in many churches, the qualities related to leadership. So we've started talking about something called collective confidence. And collective confidence is something that I think if you could take the temperature of the culture in your church, one of the things you'd like to know is what is the overall level of, as a group, how confident we feel as a church in ourselves, in meeting our vision, in being innovative, in being a good place to be. And that actually affects things like inviting, of course. So that's become a really important concept that we're pushing. Build a culture of collective confidence. And so underneath that, we're saying clarify the vision of your church and align the activities in your church around that vision. Be prepared to start new initiatives and equip and empower your lay leadership, everybody in church, the priesthood of all believers. It's interesting how, you can get a different perspective on a minister depending on who you talk to. And I was talking to someone recently about a leader in a church, and I said, oh, that guy, he's going to get snapped up. Someone's going to want to get hold of him, and he's an assistant minister at the moment. And someone who worked with him said to me, yeah, he doesn't delegate though. He's got to do everything himself, and he's exhausted all the time. So we've got this massively competent person, but who needs to learn how to empower other people more and equip them, even though he'd probably do a better job in a lot of cases, but he can't do everything. And so that's going to be a critical thing that guy needs to learn. So here's some other trends in church health that we've seen. Churches have an increasing percentage of people who say, I know what the vision of this church is and I'm committed to it. And that is a good thing. That's why these churches are the ones that are still open. I think we would expect that trend to increase, because vision has become more important than ever as church and society have drifted a little bit further apart, where as our society continues to secularize and church doesn't make sense as easily, stuff can't remain unsaid as to who are we, what do we stand for, where are we going. Those things have to be clearer. And so it's heartening that more people are saying, I see a vision in this church. I see that this church has a vision. And it's really heartening that people are saying I'm committed to it as well. And so that is definitely a challenge for all of us as church leaders, is how shall we articulate our vision here? And that's not really a question that's supposed to happen in the back room between one or two leaders. Otherwise, it's just going to be your vision, not our vision. So how are we going to discover and articulate our vision? And then how are we going to do it in such a way that people invest and buy into it and want to be on board and say, yes, this is my community of faith. This is the place where I'm invested and I'm going to be giving of myself because I believe in what's happening here. We see a real increase in churches, in people saying this church is ready to try something new. And I don't mean they're saying this church really needs to try something new. I mean, people who are saying they see that increasingly as part of the culture of their church. That is definitely a signpost of the need for adaptation, that churches are realizing you can't just keep doing everything the way we've always done. Some other things that have been relatively stable, and I'll leave it to you to question whether that's a good thing or not. We've seen practically no change in the percentage of people who have a role in church. So over the years, about 40% of people say, I have some kind of role in this church. So they're on the roster, or they have something else that they consider to be a ministry of theirs in the church. And that barely hasn't changed. Isn't that interesting? Maybe that's something that in some ways we accept as a normal thing in a herd of Christians, that you're going to have the more involved people and the less involved people. But that's a really interesting thing that it stayed flat. Another thing which I think isn't necessarily a great thing that's staying flat is the percentage of people who say their gifts and skills are being encouraged. That is one of the things that we would say needs to keep going up. And that was that last point, number 10. We need to equip and empower lay leadership. So I guess overall I want to say when we look at all the signs of health in the Australian church, not saying they're all fantastic, not saying they can't get better, but they're actually getting stronger over time. And we believe the church is adapting, and that those that don't adapt are gone and they're no longer in our figures 5 years later. So this is, I think I've highlighted for you some of the things that churches need to do to adapt. And that idea of collective confidence you'll hear more about. Yeah, so that's my first talk. That's the things that I wanted to share with you that we've pulled out as key things. And just a quick look at Baptist churches South Sydney as well, because of the churches that took part in the last NCLS, we actually did put together a profile just of those results and said, how does Baptist South Sydney compare to Baptist churches in general? And there are some strengths here. The greatest strengths in the Baptist churches in South Sydney, from the group that took part, which is nowhere near everybody. We'd love it to be in the future, but it wasn't this time. Probably the greatest areas of strength were worship and innovation. But I've highlighted there the ones that were strong. And then the weaker areas were belonging, where it's not as strong as in the Baptist movement in general, where leadership culture, so that idea I was just talking about empowering people in their gifts, not as strong. Inviting, not as strong. We're not talking about massive differences here, but not as strong. And inclusion. And I put our 9 core qualities over on the side. And look, folks, that's just our list of what we consider to be healthy things. We think it's a good list. In fact, we've done a paper recently that you can get off our website. I think you have to pay for it, but it's everybody's list. It's a review of all the different versions of models of church health that people have come up with over the last decades in various countries. And our list is really more comprehensive than pretty much any other list there. You'll see ours, but you'll see some missing off other people's. But the reason they're there for us is because these are the things we've been measuring since '91 in Australia, and we've seen them as linked to healthy churches. So well worth thinking about. And so from that, I want to segue into my second part, which is, how do you review yourself as a church? Some of you have not done NCLS, I assume, and some of you may have, but a long time ago. I want to just point to one thing that we've got in our results here. If you had NCLS results, if you went to page 25 of your last booklet, in 2016, it was on page 25, you would see this circle of strengths. And what is this? Is those same 9 core qualities that were back in the last diagram. All 9 are there. And this time they're ranked for your church. But in fact, this is the ranking you're looking at here on the screen for Baptist Churches South Sydney. So it's showing where the greatest strengths and greatest weaknesses are. So what does this do? What's the point of this? Well, the point of this is you can't work on everything, okay? There are times to think about everything. There's times to list everything. I was sitting down with a pastor on Monday, actually, who's just starting this brilliant process of strategic planning for his church. It's the right time for them to do this, and they're going to use their NCLS results, which is really what NCLS stuff is for. It's for a moment of evaluation and planning, or it's for a big process if you want to do that. And so they're going to list everything. They're going to talk about everything, but even they need to prioritize. And so when you look at something like this, you can, if they were your results, and then someone says, I really think we need to be more innovative in this church. I think we need to really focus on that. We're not innovative enough. The results would tell me, well, you know what? You probably don't need to focus on that in this church because you're already pretty awesome at that. Maybe that's just part of our strength, and that's really great. And maybe that's where your energy for this is coming from. And that's something we should celebrate. So those top strengths are definitely things to celebrate. And they're definitely not things that you want to, stop peddling on, because they may be the very reasons why people love your church. But they're not necessarily the things you need to invest as hugely into, because they're doing okay at the moment. There's other areas that you may think you're doing okay, but then surprised in the NCLS results to find, oh, actually, we're not doing as well as Baptist churches in general are doing. So what's going on there? Why is that happening for us? So I'd recommend that page is a great page to look at in your results. And down the bottom of the page actually shows where the numbers come from. So that ranking is just what's the biggest number? Innovation, 8.6. So that gets to be the first circle. And those numbers actually all represent where this group, in this case, will normally be where your church is on a bell curve. So 5 in the middle, 0 at the bottom, 10 at the top. If you're at 8.6, you're doing really well. You're right up the bell curve. It's pretty hard to get much higher. By comparison, faith sharing there, you can see is 4.5. So that means this area is below average. It means if you put all the churches together in Australia, there's a lot more churches doing stronger in this. So that's one way to make it fair to compare results that are really about very different topics. And so as you think about reviewing your church, as I've talked to churches over the years and we've considered together, what do you do with this stuff? What do you do with NCLS? That is something that really presses upon us as we need to continue to communicate and do a better job of communicating how churches actually find this helpful. So NCLS is supposed to help you do your job. And I get sad when I speak to pastors and other leaders who say, oh, we did it, but we didn't really know how to use it. So rest assured, folks, if that's been you, we are continuing to think creatively about how we can. And this is my latest take on that you should be asking yourself 4 things if you want to review your church health. And this is irrespective of NCLS, but it is relevant to NCLS, so I'm going to use that as the example. So NCLS is a church process. It's a local church process, okay? Even if you looked at a denomination, if you wanted to change a denomination, if you wanted to move a denomination in a different direction, it would happen at the local church level. It's really, that's what it is. It's made up of local churches. And so NCLS is first and foremost a process that happens at the local church for evaluation and for planning for the future. And there's 4 things you should ask yourself. Are we going to be internal or external in this process? Okay, that's an important thing to ask yourself. So an internal process means the staff might look at it, the wider leadership team, the deacons or elders and those volunteer leaders might look at it, and then eventually the congregation as well. There might be a process of communicating. But that's an important question to ask yourself. Are we going to be internal, and this is just going to be our thing, and some people find that they're fine doing that, or are we going to have external input? We're going to ask for a regional minister to give us their input, who after all has probably worked with a number of churches doing exactly the same thing. So they're going to help you to not reinvent the wheel potentially. Or a coach, same thing. There are coaches that use our material. So that can be just a huge accelerator to getting through to the useful stuff. Or a mentor, if you just, even as a leader, you just think, I just want to at least sit down with my mentor or whoever I do professional supervision with, or whoever that is, or even if I'm just in a mutual relationship. I'm in really close friendships with 3 other guys. We call it mutual mentoring, and we're one-to-one with each. And even just to sit down with them and say, can I just talk this stuff through with you? So that would be getting some external input. So that's the first thing that I think everyone should be asking themselves. If we're going to review how we're going as a church, you don't have to do it all yourself. So you can decide you will, or you can look for external input. Second thing I think you need to realise and work with if you're reviewing your church is that there are stages of doing this, okay? You're not going to do it in an afternoon. And when it comes to doing an NCLS, for example, there is a preparation phase, and this is a congregation-wide exercise. So to prepare people is to tell them your opinion matters to us. We want your input as we plan. And then on the day it's run well, okay? Because that makes a statement, doesn't it? That you meant what you said when you said, we respect your opinion and we want it. If you suddenly realize you don't have any pencils and you've got to grab the crayons out of the creche, then that doesn't wash too well, does it? When you told them that this process was really important. So even those early stages, when you're asking people to have input, guess what effect that has on people? It's either going to increase their sense of ownership of, yeah, we're doing some evaluating as a church. We're thinking about our mission and our vision and where we're going. It's either going to increase that or it's going to be wasted because it was just treated like an administration exercise. And then when you get the results, you're going to evaluate. That's, I'm sure, going to start with the leaders. What are we seeing? How does this fit with our calling? How do we understand this? But it's got to continue on from there. There should be further stages. There should be a communication stage where you go back to the church and you share with them, this is what we've learned. Even if it's just as simple as, let's celebrate some strengths together. Let's get these people up the front and affirm them for their ministry, because our results have confirmed that they are doing an awesome job and that as a church, we are strong in this area because of them. And then think about how affirming that can be. So just that communication phase is really important. And then as it turns into plans, to communicate those plans, and people can say, oh, I see where this came from. Yeah, this came out of this whole process that we did. This isn't just some random thing that, the leaders got this out of someone's favorite new book or something. This has come from us. We've had input into this. And, it doesn't necessarily mean it's all being controlled by what the NCLS brought up, but it's fed in, and they, guess what happens to their ownership as a result of that? Their sense of investment in church and willing to get on board with things. And then last of all, we'd say there's an action, right? If none of this results in action, then it's just been an intellectual exercise, and it should be far more than that. The church has a job to do. So think about how this translates into action. And then the following time you review, whether that be with an NCLS or whether that be with some other process, you're evaluating those actions. You're saying, did it make any difference? So yeah, there's some emphasis for you. The third thing that I want to say, am I up to 3? What was the next one? Yeah, third thing is targeted So I mentioned this already. You can't talk about everything. You need to prioritize. And so one group will look at their NCLS results and say, we have to have a conversation about worship in this church. That's what our results are telling us. And we also need to talk about vision. Another church will come up with other conversations. So it needs to be targeted. So where will this, if you enter a phase of evaluation and planning for your church, where will this phase have its focus? Because it can't be everywhere. And lastly, the local church process has to be appropriate to capacity. So what I mean by that is not every church is in the same position. Not every church has the same size or the same leadership size or the same energy levels, depending on what it's going through, the same resources. So in our case, we offer different processes for churches, but basically we would always encourage a church to ask yourselves at the beginning of this, what are we ready for? What are we up for as a church? Would we be up for more if we could delegate this to some gung-ho person or group of people who are really going to carry this through? Does it have to be on your shoulders, for example? Or could it be a committee that reports to you and to the leadership, but actually carries this and therefore you can get more out of it? So, you know, some churches, they just need a moment of celebration of some strengths, okay? And we've got a process that's one meeting for doing that. Some churches can do something that's maybe 2 meetings. So they might do it over a church weekend, for example, where they check in, they think about some course correction, and they say, hey, we hadn't realised this needs to be a priority, that community is slipping in our congregation. People don't have a strong sense of belonging. Okay, so let's make sure that as whatever we're planning for the next year, let's always ask ourselves, is this going to help community? Because that's an issue for us at the moment. Or is it going to make it even harder for people to connect? So yeah, we learned that from NCLS. It didn't take over. It didn't, you know, grab the steering wheel and determine everything, but it was a good input for us to learn. And we've done a course correction on our plans because of that. Or a big process, we say, no, we're really ready for the whole thing. We want to do the whole vision, mission setting, objectives, goals, all that. And so you can do that as well, and there'd be a lot more sessions involved. So yeah, and as I mentioned before, I'm interested in your questions. So if you want to, you're even welcome to start a blank email now and start writing me a question if you want to, based on what I've shared so far. So look, folks, just in the last 5 minutes or so, last few minutes actually, because we're going to have a moment for questions as well, I want to just mention sustainable leadership. So sustainable leadership, thriving and surviving in ministry. We've done a lot on this over the years. I actually had worked on this area before I came to NCLS as well. It's one of the reasons I joined NCLS. We've got books and various things that have come out over the years. You can go on to our website and download free fact sheets. Like that fact sheet there is one I wrote some years ago, summarising. I don't have time now to go into detail, but I want to just emphasise to you, especially in this time, that there are some important things to reflect on. I'm going to flick through these slides because I don't have time. I probably should have taken a whole lot of them out. We should all be reflecting on where we are between thriving or burning out or somewhere in the middle, surviving, hopefully at least managing well, but not everyone is there. And we've asked people how they would rate their effectiveness. And here's pastors across Australia from the previous survey. Most pastors are saying, I'm feeling pretty effective in my role. I'm feeling pretty good about that. It's just subjective, but there you go. Then we asked them how stressed they felt. And most pastors went, yeah, I'm feeling pretty stressed as well. So it's interesting, isn't it, how they can go together, that feeling effective and being stressed are not mutually exclusive. They actually more often go together. And not all stress is bad either. Let me emphasize that there's such a thing, they call it distress, bad, and eustress, good. So the idea that stress will actually energize you in some ways. Say, yeah, let's do this. Let's tackle this. So not all stress is bad, but obviously chronic stress for a long time is not how our body was built to cope. And that is literally the cause of burnout, is chronic stress. And just in this coronavirus time, I want to say the following. this is not a normal time, okay? You can expect to feel more stressed and also less effective. So you get the double header. You get to experience probably both of those things. Now, you might be one of these people who's actually thriving in this time and thinks it's fantastic. But if you are feeling more stressed and less effective, that is pretty normal at a time like this, especially for someone in pastoral ministry. I would also say this is probably not the time to be questioning your calling or rethinking if you should be in ministry, all other things being equal, or maybe there's a reason why you should be asking that, but not because of this season, because this season, while it's going to change some things and it's going to be a slow transition, this is not normal. And this is not what you train for. You know, you didn't train to minister to people online and hardly ever see them in person and hardly ever get to preach to groups and all that. We know that we train for something other than that. And I also want to say, if you are not coping well, have the conversation with someone. There are plenty of people needing to have those conversations at the moment. And if you're one of those people, that is perfectly fine. You should be doing that. So look, I'm going to stop there because we need to have time for questions. I'm going to try.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. That's great. And just want to for a moment tap into what you were just saying just then. Yeah. That our team are here for you as a first port of call if you're not coping. So our Leanne and Tim and Ken and myself, just a phone call or a message or a text or something away, an email or a Zoom away, and we're more than happy to chat with you. We might not be the only person you talk to, but we're really happy to support our pastors in our region during this time. So yeah. Thanks for that, Sam. Are there some questions? Let me just look back at the thing here. Oh, by the way, it's been recorded, so Virginia will get around some resources for you after this. Is there anyone who's can just pop themselves off mute and ask a question? I've got one to kick us off, actually, Sam. Over the years, we've talked about there being a decline, and then you talked early on about there being some uptake in some of those areas. Has there been any thinking about any reasons for that to do with the sample? So if there's been decline, you've got the remnant left, and then that may impact some of those uptakes because the people who are left are the people who are more enthusiastic in the first place. Has that figured into the factors, or might there be other things going on?
I think that, I think I'm even maybe tried to allude to that just now, that, the church in Australia is under challenge because Australia is changing, okay? And you can't do church the way you used to do it in generations past unless you're in a Bible Belt. You can probably get away with it then. You can probably just focus on some of the basic things, and there'll be enough people who show up at church who assume the same things as you, and it'll be okay. But unless you're in one of those areas, and a lot of the southern Sydney does probably classify as a Bible Belt. I'm not sure exactly the extent of your region. But unless you're in an area like that, then you've been challenged by change, where there are less and less people who know who Jesus is, who know why would they want to connect with it. And there's an increasing antagonism against church publicly and, in much of the media, for example, and some of it's well earned. So as a result, churches have struggled, and as people have moved out of church, you're left with the people who are the committed ones and the more enthusiastic. So there's some truth in that. But I'd say also, we did some interesting sums recently on, has the church actually shrunk in Australia? You know what? It hasn't barely shrunk since the 1960s. I can show you some stuff some other time. What's happened is the Australian population's got a lot bigger. But the reason we're not seeing lots of closed churches all over Australia is because there hasn't actually been massive decline. And what decline there has been, we're thinking is almost stopped now, especially among the Protestants. So it's not so much that we've declined. When you see those numbers going down, that's because they're percentages, and the population's been getting bigger. And the real challenge is the Australian church hasn't been keeping up with it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, wow, that's really interesting. Thanks, Dan.
It would be fair to say overall that church has become a less nominal place. That's what you'd expect. As society and church shift apart, you've got less nominal people in church, and therefore as you measure church, you are seeing the commitment. But I think what we have seen is, the churches that are adapting and that are staying open, these are the kinds of things that they're doing.
Yep, for sure. Any other questions? You can pop your mute off and ask a question of Sam while you got the chance.
Yes, Sam, I have a question. Tim Burns here.
Yep.
We hear encouraging reports about the growth of our culturally and linguistically diverse churches. Do those churches participate as much in the NCLS surveys as other churches do?
We certainly want them to, and we translate into various languages as well, and we're always looking for the next language we should be translating. But having said that, it's harder to get multicultural churches involved if there's a strong ethnic group, because we find even the communication is harder. And even within the denomination, a lot of denominations say to us, look, we've communicated to all our churches, but we don't usually hear back from this group as easily. So it's definitely a challenge. We would therefore say that our figures are probably, the ethnic group is probably less represented than it should be, but it's definitely there.
So if the encouraging stories we hear about these churches are true, the picture could be even more encouraging than it is. Yes,
it could be. And the caveat that I'd put on that, or the warning, is it might only be temporary. So, particularly groups in the first wave of immigration, of course, just think of it, if it was you, if you were moving to a culture that was very different from your own, of course you'd be looking for community amongst like-minded people. That doesn't happen in the second generation, though. Those kids are growing up in it. They're growing up in Australia. They're going to school. They're speaking more English than their parents are ever going to. So it might be a reprieve, and it's wonderful that happens, because it says something about the nature of church, that it's welcoming. But it's not going to be a long-term thing either. We need to take courage from that and be encouraged, but we also need to keep wrestling with how do we reach the long-term Australian community.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Tim. Any other questions?
Just a question I've got. Steve Tuck here from Colton Colbert Baptist Church. My question is faith sharing. How do we help our people share their faith? I guess you can't really answer that quickly. That's a tough question.
Yeah.
And I think maybe like apologetics has a role here.
Yeah.
And I guess tied with this is how do we get people to invite to church? We feel the tension between, sometimes as pastors, we want everyone to be sharing their faith. And sometimes our people just want for us to organise a great event and us to share the gospel so they can just simply invite people to. So there's a tension between, do we get our people to share their faith, or do they just bring people to church and we share the gospel? And actually I can share some thoughts there, but it is a difficult one. I think that one of the things we have to recognise as society and church values have moved further apart and they don't overlap so much anymore, is that it's probably less likely that if you did bring someone along to an event, they would hear the gospel and respond straight away. Because actually, in the past, many of those people had a lot of latent belief already. They knew half the story, they'd considered it, and this was the moment that made them step back and go, yeah, I get it. Okay. Now, if things have moved further apart, they're more likely to come along and go, wow, this is totally new. I don't know what any of this means. So it'd be lovely to get some fantastic conversions. But the long game and the long regular contact is probably going, I would imagine, is going to be more effective than the one-off event. So I would encourage that you think about every church service as a missional event and outward focused, rather than say, oh, we're going to do one of these every 3 months or so. The other thing is, because of that moving apart, churches need to run more stepping stone activities, stepping stones into church. And you might think, oh my gosh, I've got to run something else now as well as church. But find something that is safe to come to, that is not threatening, that is not confronting. It might not even seem very Christian at all. Just, a meal or a games night or something, just go,
gee, these people are nice, you know, gee, I'd love my kids to have some of these people as role models. So that experience of connecting with community, because people do long for community. And then I'll finish with just two things about sharing faith that we've seen from our research is, if you think about it, when we saw it, sometimes you think, oh, it's obvious now that we've seen it. There's really two major area reasons why people share their faith. One is because they're committed Christians, okay? And so if that's your only thing you're thinking in your head, you'll be thinking, okay, we've just got to get people more committed to their faith, because when they're stronger disciples and they're more on fire, then they're going to share their faith more. And if they're not sharing their faith, that must be the problem, right? Well, that's definitely true, that we need to be committed to our faith. The other thing, though, is they need to feel good about their church, okay? They need to have confidence in their church as a nice place to bring these friends of theirs that they like and that they want to stay friends with. So we need to also be aware that churches that have this high level of what I was talking about before, collective confidence, that this is a good place to be, this church. You know, when I come to church here, I feel like it's actually easier to do life. You know, I'd give up a lot of things in my week, but I wouldn't give this up because this is making my life better. You know, that feeling that church gives you. That if we were increasing that, then of course people would be more likely to invite. So it's about personal commitment, but also about confidence in who we are as a group. And that's where these stepping stone events can also help. Obviously, it's easier to invite people to that stuff and still impact them in really profound ways.
I've just got one more follow-up question, and that's in relation to innovation. An interesting question would be, what are the make or break innovations that are necessary for churches to survive? Like, I guess in recent years, churches have had to develop websites.
Yeah.
And like 20 or 30 years ago, it wasn't necessary. More recently, we've had to develop the ability to Zoom or to be online in some way with this COVID thing. So they're two examples of make or break innovations. You might have others. Yeah,
I mean, how many churches are with really good websites? I was just so grateful they did that last year, you know, or the year before. This has come up now, and, you know, other churches are just invisible. So, yeah, and you're right, 10 years ago, I mean, actually 15 years ago, NCLS made a web page for every church in Australia and offered it to them and just said, look, we're not even going to ask you to pay for this. We just, if you want a page, here it is, just to, you know, get yourself out there. So, yeah, I think technological innovations, definitely. But beyond that, I don't know, you've really piqued my interest there, Steve. I'm not sure. I don't want to just make up stuff now, but it is interesting to think, what are the make or break innovations? I'm going to remember that question. Sorry, I'm not going to answer it any further than that.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, the innovation is a big question. We've all been forced to do it, haven't we? And we're to hope that we'll learn some lessons about that going forward after the COVID season is finished too. We're going to halt the bigger session there, though. Although if you did have a question you thought I should have asked that, you can pop it in the chat and we can get some communication back to you. But thanks, Sam, for sharing that with us. And there was contact details on the end of your slide there, but the recording will have all that information in there, and we can get some information to you if you wanted to contact Sam, of course, about any NCLS stuff. And we will, as an association, as a region, be dipping into what it means for us as a region to be involved in NCLS, particularly in 2021, because that'll be the big push for the next round of surveys. So thanks heaps, Sam.